Good afternoon. Welcome to the tea table. I am so happy you have joined me today. And it's another special holiday. And it's President's Day in America. And I know some of you are from other countries that watch the Tea Talk. And so we're going to talk a little bit about our country, America, today in honor of George Washington's birthday, which falls in the month of February. And also next week, I'm going to cover Abraham Lincoln. I felt it was too much to cover them both. They are so amazing and wonderful heritage to cover. I don't want to rush it. So I have the music playing today. I found a lost CD called Bach for Breakfast that a dear friend gave me many years ago, and it had gotten lost, and I found it. And I thought how appropriate to play Bach for George Washington, because he was a contemporary. And I know that Thomas Jefferson, who was also a great American father, founding father, played the violin and greatly admired Johann Sebastian Bach and played his music. Mozart comes in there too, a little bit later, and actually Thomas Jefferson met Mozart, and he liked him, but he loved the music of Bach. Bach is very spiritual and is really the king of classical music. We all look to him. Well, have you gotten your tea yet? If not, please pause and I'll be waiting for you. Okay, well, the tea on the tea tray today is a very special pot. And it's the oldest pot and I own in my home. It is from my mother and her family, and they actually immigrated from Scotland, turn of the century. Her mother and her father had immigrated from Danzig in the 1880s. And so this was not directly from their family. However, I don't know how they came upon it, but she always told me it goes back to the days of Paul Revere, the great Paul Revere. Remember the midnight ride of Paul Revere? Well, he was a silversmith, and I have no way of proving this, but I want to show you this pot. It's very special, and it just has a really lovely, I like when pots have little feet to sit on them, and this one does. So in honor of President's Day and America, we're going to pour out of this pot. And I have here a little cup. I thought a little cup that is pink and looks a little French, because what the early Americans were fascinated was French fashion, French China. You remember, the French also were seeking liberty. Remember the French Revolution? Sadly, it wasn't based on law the way the American Revolution is, and it ended in terrible bloodshed, and it was really travesty in history. But the French have these gorgeous china and clothing, and I chose a lamp today that is in the period of the American Revolution clothing. And you see the man is playing the violin, the lady's playing the piano. And there's so many figurines that go back to this 1700 period. You've all seen the pictures. Let me get a little bit of milk in my tea. And I'm going to take a little sip and then we'll... Oh, that's so nice. A little cup is nice. See how pretty it is? It has a little pink rose. Here's the pink rose and a little aqua and gold. And this is a piece of English china, but I believe that at that period in history, they were using a lot of French design. And so I also have these little figurines that I always have sitting. I love figurines. And these are always sitting on my little tea table here in my music room. But they also look very much in keeping with George and Martha Washington and that early American period. And, you know, I kept pondering and thinking, so much went on in the 1700s. I'm in love with the 1700s. You know, for some of you on here, you've heard my history lectures, and I created a tree to teach young people his tree, and divided it into 10 parts from Christ to today. And so we go through the different parts. Well, up in the branch is, we get up to Renaissance, and then we get a bud, and we get the Reformation, and then we get the flower, and we get the 1600s, and then we get the 1700s, and because it takes all these centuries to come up with what we end up with, right? You know, nothing is born in a vacuum. Well, in the 1700s, just to mention a few, as I said, we had Johann Sebastian Bach, and the music had reached an apex. He was a Lutheran and had come about 150 years after Martin Luther and took all of that theology of freedom in Christ and dancing and singing and the glory and put it into music, and was a genius. And his family went back, as far back as they can find. The Bachs are musicians. So sometimes it takes generations to establish something truly great. Well, in the 1700s, we have talked about many of these great people. Remember Samuel Johnson in England, the great dictionary man? Yes, he's right in there. I think the dictionary is published right in there in the 1760s. And so it's framing everything. And then we have Bach, and then we have Mozart, and very soon we get Beethoven. And we get this incredible choral music, and oh my goodness, oratorios. We move up a little bit later. We also have Handel, and we, you know, have Haydn. It's just an explosion of creativity. And then we have in America, so I would call 1700s revivals and revolutions, because then we have the great John Wesley in England, born in 1703. And all through the 1700s, he develops this incredible movement of really helping people. And they call him a Methodist. He was really an Anglican, but he got booted out of the church because he wanted to help the poor, and he was bringing in what they called the riff raff. But you know, it is said of Wesley, he would walk into squalor and filth and leave behind him beauty and order. That's God. And then in America, in the same year, 1703, we have the great Jonathan Edwards, who brought the Great Awakening and the great revivals in America. which it is said historically, without those revivals and the unifying factor they brought, there would never have been an American Revolution, because you couldn't have unified the people. They were so splintered off in different groups until that Great Awakening. So everything fits together, and history has a story. Well, George Washington is born into this, and he is considered the greatest man alive. And I have read so much on George Washington. Around the world, they said next to Christ, he is the greatest man that has ever lived. He had flawless character. He was honest, you know. We'll talk next week about Honest Abe. Well, George Washington also was honest. Remember, he wouldn't tell a lie. And do you know, in the sports world, when he was a young boy, everything was a race. You know, racing is the oldest sport, going right back to the Greeks, and, you know, it's even mentioned in the Bible, run the race, right? So he was the fastest in his town, yes. Well, he was 6'3", which was very tall for those, very tall now, but even then very tall. Very athletically built and could ride a horse, and very dignified. And he was a very spiritual man, but very quiet about it. He would disappear every morning. I believe it was 7 o'clock. He had an hour alone. He did not want to be disturbed in his room. And that was his time of studying the scriptures and prayer. And I believe in the evening he repeated that. And that was his disciplined habit of his life. You know, nothing comes out so great when you are tested in the fire of battle and the fire of the political swirls of America. To come out like gold, he had to have some deep moral fiber. And George Washington was admired. I was going to say all over the world, they would look to him. And here's one picture of him when he was, you know, I have so many pictures of him up in my library, but I couldn't bring them all down. But this is a very special book I have, and it's called The World of George Washington. And it goes into all, it's a very big, I can hardly pick this book up. And it goes into all of the, what the world was like at his time. And it goes into all the battles. And you know, the famous, there were so many famous battles that George Washington won. And I can't really go into those today. But there's the really famous one where he was shot at, and his horse was shot out from under him and died. And he left without a scratch. They gave him another horse and they shot it again. And the Indian tribe said, he is a righteous, holy man. God protects him. Isn't that amazing? And then we all know the story of going across the Delaware and all of the difficulties George Washington faced, and to come out and win and survive. And in our town, in Olympia, downtown, we have the old Capitol building, beautiful building. I'd love to do a tea talk there sometime when it's a little better weather. It's right across from Sylvester Park, and it's built with turrets like a castle. Well, now it houses the education building for the state of Washington, for the public schools. Well, in front is a little statue, probably stands about, I don't know, 12 to 15 feet high. It's sitting up on a block, and it's the famous statue of George Washington praying. And you know, that's the story. You know, at Valley Forge, he went out in the woods. He didn't think anyone saw him. and ask God to help. It was such difficult. The men had blood in the snow. They didn't have decent shoes. Their feet were bleeding. They were freezing to death. It was impossible. And he prayed, and God helped him. And that America is founded on that prayer. And we received that as a state, I guess 100 years ago or so, as a gift, because there's a larger one in Washington, D.C. And because we are called Washington, we received it. And so if you ever come to Olympia, you can drive by and see it. It's really a lovely tribute. And I like being a part of Washington State. I love the name. And you know, our state seal is the face of George Washington. And what they used, a man said, let's use the quarter. This is a true story. So they circled the quarter, and then they blew it up, and they created the great seal of the state of Washington, and it's from the quarter. Isn't that great? Well, on my tea tray today, we're having something special, and I know you're going to want a bite, but I'm going to encourage you to make your own. Okay, this is a lovely cherry pie, and my husband bought this. Yes, he bought it, and it to celebrate George Washington's birthday. And you know, the reason we have cherry pie, remember? Because George Washington wouldn't tell a lie. And when he was asked about cutting down the cherry tree, he told the truth. And you know, sometimes it's not easy to tell the truth. But if we do, we'll never be sorry. And it's good to be as honest with ourselves and with others as we possibly can be. And God will help us. So I encourage us to look at George Washington's life. He could never have been the leader he was if he hadn't had the character as a young person to choose the right way. Well, on my little tea cart today, I have something special, and they're from Mount Vernon. Now, I've never been to Mount Vernon, but these are little salt and pepper shakers, George and Martha's. And they're quite old, and so they're quite interesting, and I put them on. It would be fun to have a creamer and sugar, but a salt and pepper is nice. So I have one more special treasure to show you. Now this is something that I really love. And this is I have a china closet that has all blue and white. And this is one of my centerpieces. And it's George Washington. And it's called Flow Blue. When the china kind of flows, it's called a flow blue. And it was a method used throughout different times. I think it originally was a mistake, and then it became very valuable because it was rare, and then they started making it. So this is George, and I thought, well, you know, Martha, I read he was 28 years old when they married, and she was 27. And she had already been married. Her husband had died, sadly, suddenly, of a very serious kind of a disease or an attack. And so they had met, and she was very special, and Martha. And so George Washington wanted to marry her. And she had had 4 children, and she was only 27. She had been married probably at 19. 2 had lived, a girl and a boy, and so George adopted them, and they became his children. And you know, they didn't have any children of their own, but he's called the father of our country. So he has many children, doesn't he? Yes. Well, now this is a little purse. And I just think it kind of reminds me of a purse that Martha would have had. You know, they made them out of this is out of velvet and little jewels, kind of French. The French really, really, really dominated the fashion. And then it goes over. Wear it over your head. This. And it's really nice. I like it very much. And you know, it holds a lot. I've used that purse before. I can put a cell phone in, a little money, a lipstick, a handkerchief, and I can go. So it's a pretty practical. In fact, they used to, sometimes you'll see them in the reproduction movies from the 17 and 1800s. They'll attach them to their dress so they're hands-free. And the lady would use that purse to pay the bills to all the people. But George and Martha had a beautiful marriage, and they had tea, and they danced the minuet. And they liked to dance the minuet, and they had wonderful parties. He had a beautiful farm, you know, Mount Vernon, acres and acres. And actually, my husband's heritage goes back. The Abernathys were neighbors of George Washington. My husband thinks that his ancestor fought in the battle with George Washington. Well, we don't know for sure. We'll have to consider studying that a little deeper. But I wanted a little flower on the tea cart, and I have a little candle for you. I'm going to pick it up and just show you. See? It's fun to put different things. This is a rather large tray, so it can hold quite a bit. And I think that to celebrate each holiday and honor the Founding Fathers, especially for the children, so important. When I was young, because we lived in Washington State, this is before they had President's Day as one day, we would get a day off for Washington and for Lincoln. We got 2 days off. I remember that. And then they decided, let's combine the presidents together. And so now it's President's Day. And it's a nice to have a holiday like this in February, isn't it? Many great men are born in February. It's an interesting month. Many of the presidents are actually, I know Ronald Reagan was born in February. So it is a good month. And it's a fun month to have a birthday because there's not a lot going on. So it creates a good reason to have a party. And we're always interested in that, right? We want to have reasons to celebrate. Well, I just think that perhaps what I wanted to encourage you to do is maybe make a little cherry tart. That's what I am going to do for my gathering that I'm going to have here. I'm going to make homemade cherry tarts. And do you know, I've never done it, but I tasted one once years ago and I never forgot how delicious it was. And little tarts are nice because you can serve one to each person. And I think homemade is the best if we can have time to do it. Well, I encourage you to study a little bit this week about George Washington. And I know you probably have all studied him, but there's so much more to know about a person. And then as we study him, we study the people around him. You're automatically going to learn about John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and all of the great men that really gave us this beautiful country, this freedom that is priceless. And You know, you have to study history to realize it's rare to have 250 years of freedom without a dictator or an autocrat. It's unheard of in history. Just start studying. You'll go right through the Middle Ages and you'll see there was always this battle, you know, that the few wanted to control the many. And, you know, we talked about that, the Middle Ages, where you had, just like a chessboard, you had a king and a queen, you had a bishop, you had the church and the royalty, and then you might have a knight. He could lift himself up. The majority of the people were pawns. They were under it, and they had to make it. They had to make their way. They had no chance to lift above that. Only America has given people the opportunity to come with absolutely nothing and make a life and create. It's called the American dream. We take it for granted, and I know most of us, including myself, we don't even begin to scratch the surface of what we could do. Our opportunities here are limitless. And so I encourage you, if you have a dream and you want to write, or you want to sing, or you want to do something creative, something scientific, something inventive, I encourage you, do it. One other special thing, I just have to close with this. You know, when we think of the 1700s, you know, we have the famous book written by Charles Dickens, Tale of Two Cities, and that's set in the 1700s. It's London and Paris, and it is talking about the French Revolution. Well, then we have my favorite movie for all time, I believe, is The Scarlet Pimpernel, the 1935 with Leslie Howard and Merle Oberman. And it is the most beautiful, beautiful movie. So well done. It's a picture of freedom. It's a picture of a battle for freedom. And it's a picture of winning the battle. And I was looking it up again. And you know, Leslie Howard was from Hungarian Jewish descent. His family had fled persecution and ended up in London. The lady who wrote The Scarlet Pimpernel was a baroness, Ozatsky, and she and her family, as a little girl, she had fled. They were baronesses. They were the highest people in Budapest, Hungary. They had fled to London. Well, she was a woman with a title, but she didn't have any money. And she went to art school and married a wonderful man that they had true love, but they didn't have money. So she started writing books. She wanted to be a graphic artist, but she ended up writing this story, The Scarlet Pimpernel. And it became a hit, and they made plays out of it and had it in the theater in London. This would have been in, you know, early times. They called it the Old Vic. And I guess there were 2,000 performances of The Scarlet Pimpernel. It was such a popular, and it's so beautiful. Well, fast forward, in 1935, they were making movies, and another Hungarian man named Alexander Korda made many movies, and he was a freedom lover who had left his country because of persecution and because he couldn't survive to London, and got into making movies. And actually, Winston Churchill became very close to Korda and used him to make a lot of films for the war effort. He was just a beautiful, freedom-loving filmmaker, and he made that film. So there you had 3 Hungarians and doing this incredible film. I encourage you to watch it. You can get it on YouTube or anywhere, but you must get the 1935 version. It's black and white. It is absolutely so rich in truth. And I don't want to spoil it by telling you any of the plot. So I just encourage you to take it when some evening you feel you need to have a good movie, and there's love in it, there's romance in it, and it's very wholesome, but it's very deep, and it gives you a historical picture of really the price paid for freedom. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have had a good week, and I pray you have a wonderful week. Think about George Washington, and next week we're going to cover our other wonderful president, Abraham Lincoln. And when you say your prayers, just remember to thank God you were born in a free country. And may we all do our part to keep it free. Well, thank you, and God bless you, and have a good week.